Hey guys, welcome back. Just a reminder this is being shared with permission from Scholastic and will be taken down in June. Your riddle for the day, your riddle of the day for yesterday was what runs all around the backyard yet never moves? The answer was a fence. Your riddle of the day for today is what tastes better than it smells? I'll give you some time to think about that. While you're doing that, we're going to go ahead and start reading our two chapters. Remember, today we're reading chapters 25 and 26. Chapter 25 is called Work. The Smokies all had lunch together, just like at any ugly dorm. The long tables had clearly been cut from the hearts of trees, and they showed knots and whorls and wavy tracks of grains that had been run down their entire length. They were rough and beautiful, but Tally couldn't get over the thought that the trees had been taken alive. She was glad when Shay and David took her outside to the cooking fire, where a group of younger Uglies hung out. It was a relief to get away from the felled trees and from the disturbing older Uglies. Out here, at least, any of the Smokies could pass as a senior. Tally didn't have much experience in judging an Uglie's age, but she turned out to be more or less right. Two had just arrived from another city and weren't even 16 yet. The other three, Croy, Ride, and Asterix, were friends of Shay's, from the group that had run away together before Tally and Shay had first met. Here in the smoke, only 5 months, Shay's friends already had a hint of David's self-assurance. Somehow they carried the authority of middle pretties without the firm jaw, the subtle lined eyes, or the elegant clothing. They spent lunch talking about projects they were up to. A canal to bring a branch of the creek closer to the smoke. New patterns for the sheep wool of their sweaters were made from. New patterns for the sheep wool their sweaters were made from. A new latrine. Tally wondered what a latrine was. They seemed so serious, as if their lives were a really complicated trick that had to be planned and replanned every day. The food was serious too, and was piled on their plates in serious quantities. It was heavier than Tally was used to, and tasted too rich, like whenever her food history class tried to cook their own meals. But the strawberries were sweet without sugar, and although it seemed weird to eat it plain, can you mute that? Thank you. Although it seemed weird, oh man, I lost my place. The Smokies bread had its own flavor without anything added. Of course, Tally would have happily devoured anything that wasn't spagbowl. She didn't ask what was in the stew, though. The thought of dead trees was enough to deal with in one day. As they emptied their plates, Shay's friends started pumping Tally for news from the city. Dorm sports results, soap opera storylines, city politics. Had she heard of anyone else running away? Tally answered their questions as best she could. No one tried to hide their homesickness. Their faces looked years younger as they remembered old friends and old tricks. Then Asterix asked her about her journey here to the smoke. It was pretty easy, really, once I got the hang of Shay's directions. Not that easy. Took you what, 10 days? David asked. You left night before your birthday, right? Shay said. Stroke of midnight, Tally said. 9 days and a half. Troy frowned. It took a while for the Rangers to find you, didn't it? I guess so. They almost roasted me when they did. They were doing a huge burn that got out of control. Really? Whoa. Shay's friends looked depressed. My board almost burned. I had to save it and jump in the river. Is that what happened to your face? Ride asked. Tally touched the peeling skin of her nose. Well, that's kind of sunburn, she almost said, but the other faces were rapt. She had been alone so long, Tally found herself enjoying being the center of attention. The flames were all around me, she said. My shoes melted crossing this big patch of burning flowers. Shay whistled. Incredible. That's weird. The Rangers usually keep an eye out for us, David said. Well, I guess they missed me. Tally decided not to go into the fact that she'd intentionally hidden her hoverboard. Anyway, I was in the river and I'd never even seen a helicopter, except for the day before. And this thing came thundering out of the smoke, driving the fire towards me. And of course I had no idea the Rangers were the good guys. I thought they were rusty pyromaniacs risen from the grave. Everyone laughed and Tally felt herself enjoying the warmth of the group's attention. It was like telling everyone at the dorm about a really successful trick, but much better. And because she really had survived a life or death situation. David and Shay were hanging on every word. Tally was glad she hadn't activated the pendant yet. She could hardly sit here enjoying the Smokies' admiration if she'd just betrayed them all. She decided to wait until tonight when she was alone to do what she had to do. That must have been creepy, David said, his voice pulling her away from uncomfortable thoughts. Being alone in the orchids for all those days, just waiting. She shrugged. I thought they were kind of pretty. I didn't know about the whole superweed thing. David frowned at Shay. Didn't you tell her anything in your note? Shay flushed. You told me not to write anything that would give the smoke away, so I put it in code, sort of. It sounds like your code almost got her killed, David said, and Shay's face fell. He turned to Tally. Hardly anyone ever makes the trip alone. Not their first time out of the city. I've been out of the city before. Tally put her arm around Shay's shoulder comfortingly. I was fine. It was just a bunch of pretty flowers to me, and I started with 2 weeks of food. Why did you steal all spag bowl? Corey asked. You must love this stuff. The others joined in his laughter. Tally tried to smile. I didn't even notice when I was pinching it. 3 spag bowls a day for 9 days. I could hardly stomach the stuff after day 2. But you get so hungry. They nodded. They all knew about hard traveling and hard work, too, apparently. Tally had already noticed how much everyone had consumed for lunch. Maybe Shay wasn't so likely to get the not eating disease. She had cleaned her heaping plate. Well, I'm glad you made it, David said. He reached across and touched the scratches on Tally's face softly. Looks like you had more adventures than you're telling us. Tally swallowed and shrugged, hoping she looked modest. Shay smiled and hugged David. I knew you'd think Tally was awesome. A bell rang across the grounds, and they hurried to finish their food. What's that? She asked. David grinned. That's back to work. You're coming with us, Shay said. Don't worry, it won't kill you. On the way to work, Shay explained more about the long, flat roller coasters called railroads. Some stretched across the entire continent, one small part of the rusty legacy still scarring the land. But unlike most ruins, the railroads were actually useful, and not just for hoverboarding. They were the main source of metal for the Smokies. David had discovered a new railroad track a year or so earlier. It didn't run anywhere useful, so he had drawn up a plan to plunder it for metal and to build more hover paths in and around the valley. Shay had been working on the project since she'd come to the smoke 10 days before. 6 of them took their boards up and out the other side of the valley, down a stream churning with white water, and along a razor-sharp ridge filled with iron ore. From there, Tally finally understood how far up the mountain she'd come since leaving the coast. The whole continent seemed to be spread out before them. A thin bank of clouds below the ridge mirrored the heavier layers overhead, but forests, grasslands, and shimmering arcs of rivers were visible through the misty veil. The sea of white orchids could still be glimpsed from this side of the mountain, glowing like an encroaching desert in the sun. Everything's so big, Tally murmured. That's what you can never tell from inside, Shay said. How small the city is. How small they have to make everyone to keep them trapped there. Tally nodded, but she imagined all those people let loose in the countryside below, cutting down trees and killing things for food, crashing across the landscape like some risen rusty machine. Still, she wouldn't have traded anything for this moment, standing there and looking down at the plain spread out below. Tally had spent the last 4 years staring at the skyline of New Prettytown, thinking it was the most beautiful sight in the world. But she didn't think so anymore. Lower down and halfway around the mountain, another river crossed David's railroad track. The route there from the smoke twisted in all directions, taking advantage of the veins of iron, rivers, and dry creek beds. But they'd never had to leave their boards. Walking wouldn't be an option, Shay explained, when they came back loaded with heavy metal. The track was overgrown with vines and stunted trees, every wooden crosstie in the grips of a dozen tentacles of vegetation. The forest had been hacked away in patches, surrounding a few missing segments of rail, but it held the rest firmly in its grasp. How are we going to get any of this out? Tally asked. She kicked at a gnarled root, feeling puny against the strength of the wild. Watch this, Shay said. She pulled a tool from her backpack, an arm-length pole that telescoped almost out to Tally's height. She twisted one end, and 4 short struts unfolded from the others like the ribs of an umbrella. It's called a power jack, and it can move just about anything. Shay twisted the handle again, and the ribs retracted. Then she thrust one end of the jack under a cross tie. With another twist of her wrist, the pole began to shudder and a groaning sound came from the wood. Shay's feet slipped backwards, but she leaned her weight onto the pole, keeping it wedged under the cross tie. Slowly the ancient wood began to rise, tearing free from the plants and earth, bending the rail that lay across it. Callie saw the struts of the power jack unfolding underneath the tie, gradually forcing it up, the rail above beginning to pull free of its mooring. Shay grinned up at her. I told you. Let me try, Callie said, holding out her hand, her eyes wide. Shay laughed and pulled another power jack from her backpack. Take that tie there while I keep up this one. The power jacks were heavier than it looked, but its controls were simple. Callie pulled it open, jammed it under the tie that Shay had indicated. She turned the handle slowly, and the jack started to shudder in her hands. The wood began to shift, and the stresses of metal and earth twisted in her hands. Vines tore from the ground, and Callie could feel their complaints through the soles of her shoes, like a distant earthquake rumbling. A metal shriek filled the air as the rail began to bend, pulling free of vegetation and the rusty spikes that held it down for centuries. Finally the jack had opened to its full extent, the rail still only half free from its ancient bonds. She and Shay struggled to pull their jacks out. Having fun? Shay asked, wiping sweat from her brow. Callie nodded, grinning. Don't just stand there. Let's finish the job. And our next chapter is chapter 26. It's called David. A few hours later, a pile of scrap metal stood in one corner of the clearing. Each segment of the rail took an hour to get free and required all 6 of them to carry. The railroad ties sat in another pile. At least all the Smokies wood didn't come from live trees. Callie couldn't believe how much they'd salvaged, literally tearing the track from the forest grasp. She also couldn't believe her hands. They were red and raw, screaming with pain, and covered with blisters. Looks pretty bad, David said, glancing over Tallie's shoulders as she stared at them in amazement. Feels pretty bad, she said, but I didn't notice until just now. David laughed. Hard work's a good distraction, but maybe you should take a break. I was just about to scout up another line for a spot to salvage. Want to come? Sure, she said gratefully. The thought of picking up the power jack again made her hands throb. Leaving the others at the clearing, they hoverboarded up and over the gnarled trees, following the barely visible track below into dense forest. David rode low in the canopy, gracefully avoiding branches and vines, as if this were a familiar salam. Of course, Tally noticed that, like his shoes, his clothes were all handmade. City clothing only used seams and stitching for decoration, but David's jacket seemed to be cut together from a dozen patches of leather, all different shapes and shades. Its patchwork appearance reminded her of Frankenstein's monster, which led to a terrible thought. What if it were made of real leather, like in the olden days? Skins. She shuddered. He couldn't be wearing a bunch of dead animals. They weren't savages here. And she had to admit that the coat fit him well, and the leather followed the outlines of his shoulders like an old friend, and it fended off the whips of the branches better than her microfiber dorm jacket. David slowed as they came into a clearing, and Tally saw that they had reached a wall of solid rock. That's weird, she said. The railroad track seemed to plunge straight into the mountain, disappearing into the side of the boulders. The Rusties were serious about straight lines, David said. When they built rails, they didn't like to go around stuff. So they just went through? David nodded. Yeah, this used to be a tunnel cut right into the mountains. It must have collapsed sometime after the Rusty Panic. Where's the page? Do you think anyone was inside when it happened, I mean? Probably not, but you never know. There could have been a whole trainload of rusty skeletons in there. Tally swallowed, trying to imagine whatever it was in there, flattened and buried for centuries in the dark. The forest's a lot clearer around here, David said, easier to work through. I'm just worried about these boulders collapsing if we start prying rails up. They look pretty solid. Oh yeah? Check this out, David said. He stepped off his board onto a boulder and deftly climbed to a spot that lay shadowed in the setting sun. Tally angled her board closer and jumped onto a large rock next to David. When her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw that a long space extended back between the boulders. David crawled inside, his feet disappearing into the darkness. Come on, his voice called. There isn't really a trainload of dead Rusties in there, right? Not that I've found, but today might be our lucky day. Callie rolled her eyes and lowered herself onto her belly. She crawled inside, the cool weight of the rocks settling over her. A light flickered on ahead. She could see David sitting up in a small space, a flashlight glowing in his hand. She pulled herself in and took a seat next to him on a flat bit of rock. Giant shapes were stacked above them, so the tunnel didn't collapse completely. Not at all. The rocks cracked in pieces, and some big and some small. David pointed to the David pointed the flashlight down through a chink between where they sat. Tally squinted in the darkness and saw a much bigger open space below. A glint of metal revealed a segment of track. Just think, if we could get down there, we wouldn't have to pull up all those vines. All that track just waiting for us. Just 100 tons of rocks in his way, is all. He nodded. Yeah, but it would be worth it. He pointed the flashlight upward out of space, making himself hideous. No one's been down here for hundreds of years. Great. Tally's skin tingled, her eyes picking out the dark fissures all around them. Maybe no human beings had been down there for a long time, but a lot of things liked to live in cool, dark places. I keep thinking, David said, the whole thing might tumble open if we just moved the exact right boulder. And not the exact wrong one, the one that makes the whole thing crush us? David laughed and pointed the flashlight so that it lit her face rather than his. I thought you might say that. Callie peered through the darkness, trying to make out his expression. What do you mean? I can see that you're struggling with this. Struggling? With what? Being here in the smoke. You're not sure about all of it. Callie's skin tingled again, but not from the thought of snakes or bats or long-dead Rusties. She wondered if David had somehow already figured out she was a spy. No, I guess I'm not sure, she said evenly. She caught a glimmer of reflected light from David's eyes, and he nodded. That's good. You take this seriously. A lot of kids come out here and think it's all fun and games. I don't think that for a minute, she said softly. I can tell. It's not just a trick to you, like it is to most runaways. Even Shay, who really believes the operation is wrong, doesn't get how deadly serious the smoke is. Callie didn't say anything. After a long moment of silence in the dark, David continued. It's dangerous out here. The cities are like these boulders. They may seem solid, but if you start messing with them, the whole pile could crumble. I think I know what you mean, Tally said. Since the day she had gone to get her operation, she'd felt the massive weight of the city looming over her, and had learned firsthand how many places like the smoke threatened people like Dr. Cable. But I don't really understand why they care about you guys. It's a long story, but part of it is. She waited for a moment before saying, is what? Well, this is a secret. I don't usually tell people until they've been here for a while. Years. But you seem serious enough to handle it. You can trust me, Tally said, then immediately wondered why. She was a spy, an infiltrator. She was the last person David should trust. I hope I can, Tally, he said, reaching out to her. Feel the palm of my hand. She took it, running her fingers over the flesh. It was as rough as the wood grain of the table in the dining hall. The skin along his thumb was as hard and dry as leather cracking with age. No wonder he could work all day and not complain. Wow, how long does it take to get calluses like that? About 18 years. She stopped in disbelief, then compared the horn of his palm with her own tender, blistered flesh. Tally could feel it there, the grueling afternoon of real work she'd put in today, but stretched across a lifetime. But how? I'm not a runaway, Tally. I don't understand. My parents were runaways, not me. Oh, she felt stupid now, but it had never once occurred to her. If you could live in the smoke, you could raise children here too. But she hadn't seen any Littlies, and the whole place seemed so tenuous, so temporary. It would be like having a child on a camping trip. How did they manage? Without any doctors, I mean. They are doctors. Huh. But, hang on. Doctors? How old were they when they ran away? Old enough. They weren't uglies anymore. I think it's called being a middle pretty? Yeah, at least. New pretties worked or studied, if they wanted to, but few people got serious about a profession until their middle years. Wait, what do you mean they weren't uglies? They weren't, but they are now. Tally tried to get her mind to process his words. You mean they never did the third operation? They still look middle, even though they're crumblies? No, Tally, I told you. They're doctors. A shock ran through her. This was more stunning than the felled trees or the cruel pretties, as overwhelming as anything she'd felt since Paris had gone away. They reversed the operation? Yeah, they cut each other out here in the wild to make themselves. Her throat closed on the word as if she was going to gag. No, they didn't use surgery. Suddenly, the dark cave seemed to be crushing her, squeezing the air from her chest. Tally forced herself to breathe. David pulled his hand away, and with a corner of her panicked mind, Tally realized that she'd held on to it all that time. I shouldn't have told you this. No, David, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get all hyperventilated. It's my fault. You just got here, and I dumped all this on you. Bless you. But I do want you to. She fought saying it, but lost. To trust me. To tell me this stuff. I do take it seriously. That much was true. Sure, Tally, but maybe that's enough for now. We should get back. He turned and crawled towards the sunlight. As she followed, Tally thought of what David had said about the boulders. However massive, they were ready to topple if you pushed them the wrong way, ready to crush you. She felt the pendant swinging from her neck, a tiny but insistent pull. Dr. Cable would be impatient by now, waiting for the signal. But David's reputation had suddenly made everything more complicated. The smoke wasn't just a hideout for assorted runaways, she realized now. It was a real town, a city in its own right. If Tally activated the tracker, it wouldn't just mean the end of Shay's big adventure. It would be David's home taken from him, his whole life stripped away. Tally felt the weight of the mountain pressing down upon her, and found that she was still struggling to breathe as she pulled herself out into the sunlight. And that's the end of your chapters for today. Please tune in next time for the next two chapters. Have a great day.